All right. Yeah, and while we're just waiting, Tim will have a more formal introduction, but Tim Swarns is one of our panelists, and he's in the South Park neighborhood of Seattle, eager to learn from everyone's wisdom. And is it Janique? Am I pronouncing it right? Okay. From the urban monastery of Zurich, Switzerland, but she's currently visiting the Kensington neighborhood in Philadelphia, and we'll go on a walk with Shane Claiborne in an hour. Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks for making time to join us. Brother Stefan from the Community of Peace in Louisa, Virginia. Can you wave? Or I guess, oh, your picture's not turned on quite yet. Nathan Ralston from Iglesia de Cristo, Saltillo, Mexico, and interested in continuing to learn and share. Did you go? Yeah, there you are. You gave a wave. Okay. Debbie is also one of our panelists from the Jesus People in Chicago. And there she is. If you want to give a little wave, Debbie. Rusty and Mary Lou, if you guys can give a little wave over there. They're part of the Springwater community in Portland, Oregon. And our mission statement includes the phrase, loving our neighborhood. Then there's Toby from Bruderhof in Pennsylvania. And he's also on the leadership team, has been there, of Nurturing Communities, been there for quite a while. And then there's Finn from Catskill, New York, New Covenant House, and he's attended quite a few things. Good morning, Finn. Nate Durgan from Bruderhof, New Meadow Run. Good to be with you. And Josh Livingston and David Price from Inglewood in Indianapolis. So Inglewood's a sister community, quite involved. It exemplifies this intersection between church, community, and neighborhood very well. So while I think we're still waiting for one of our panelists to come, and I'm Elizabeth. I'm in living in community in Washington State, and it doesn't have a formal name, but have been involved with Nurturing Communities for quite some time. So I'll be facilitating this, but let's go ahead. I'm just going to give a short introduction to what Nurturing Communities is for those of you who are not familiar with it. I know many of us are. So Nurturing Communities is an informal and growing network of Christ-centered intentional communities that strives to support and inspire one another to live more faithfully and to bear witness more fully to God's kingdom on earth. So kind of the accent is on intentional community. And then what that means practically is Nurturing Community facilitates gatherings, both regionally and nationally. This year, there'll be more regional gatherings, and then next year, there'll be an annual gathering in Kentucky. That's the direction we're heading. Nurturing Community plays a role in mentoring for established communities to mentor communities that are just getting up and started. And it can include visitations where people come in for almost like a relational audit. So that's a service that Nurturing Community provides that's been super helpful, especially for communities in crisis. And then just connecting. We have a map and we try to just build connections between intentional communities so people don't feel so alone. And so we do that through our website and newsletters and just relational connections. And then resources. We tried to provide intentional communities with resources that would be helpful. So that's what Nurturing Community is. And so there's Jonathan, excellent. So just for those who popped on, if you can just put your name, the community that you're a part of, if you're part of a community, and then the reason why you're attending this morning. And so I'd like to just at this time introduce our panelists. Well, actually, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and just tell us a little bit about who you are. And then we'll start into our discussion. So do we want to start? I'll probably just start with my screen. We'll start with Josh because you're first on my Zoom screen, and then go down for there. Would you mind introducing yourself, Josh?
Sure. Josh Livingston. I'm a member of Englewood Christian Church on the Near East Side of Indianapolis. Also a neighbor of the Englewood neighborhood. So my house is about a block away from our church here. I'm a staff person at Englewood Community Development Corporation. And I live next door to this guy. Introduction.
No, sorry. David Price, is there any instructions on this? All right. I live next door to Josh. I've lived in the Englewood neighborhood for about 30 years now. And been part of the community here.
Excellent. So our other panelist will be Tim Sorens. Tim, if you can introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your context as well, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Tim. As Elizabeth said, I live in South Park neighborhood of Seattle, which is about 4 miles from downtown. We've been here for about 8 years. And I'll probably say a little bit more about the neighborhood a little bit later on, and also work with a parish collective, and we'll talk about that too.
Awesome. Debbie?
Hi, I'm Debbie Baumgartner, and I'm at Jesus People in Chicago, and I've been there 30 years. And yeah, just really excited to be part of the Uptown neighborhood. And we have an election coming up next week for our alderperson. And anyway, it's just a great neighborhood to be a part of, and excited for this conversation.
Excellent. And Jonathan?
Good morning, everybody. Name is Jonathan Brooks. Most people call me Pastor J. I am from Chicago as well. And I currently live in the North Lawndale neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. Serve as the pastor of Lawndale Christian Community Church there. Only been living in this neighborhood for a couple of years. It'll be 2 years in August. I bought my house here. But I've been in Chicago my whole life. I was raised on the south side of Chicago in the Englewood neighborhood, and lived there my whole life and pastored there for 20 years before making the transition over here in 2021. So super glad to be here. And I'll tell a little bit more about Lawndale and North Lawndale too later on. Also a part of Parish Collective and CCDA, and that's a big part of my story. So.
Excellent. So just to give you guys a brief outline of where we're going, this will be more of kind of a panel. What we'll be hearing specifically initially from our panelists. And the question we're interacting with is, what does it look like to live as an intentional community that is invested in the neighborhood or parish? And specifically kind of exploring the ways that often in the church there is kind of like these different lines where there's, like there's the CCDA, kind of community development line of things, and then there's intentional community and faith communities, and so there's a lot of different identities in the church, and a lot of times those don't overlap, and so that's kind of what we're trying to explore is what is the intersection of this of faith community that's committed to the neighborhood, but then it is also an intentional community. And so we'll hear from our panelists, and then we will open it up for questions. And we might, depending on how the time goes, go into small groups. But that's kind of the flavor or the direction that we're hoping to go. So yeah, I'd like to just, and again, this is being recorded. And if you're new, if you want to just insert your name, where you're from, and your reason for joining this time in the chat, that would be great. So we can kind of get a sense of each other. So I'm just going to start it off. I would love to hear from our panelists just what you see are, like, how do you see this division in the church, and then what do you like? What are the communities where you've seen the focus of community, neighborhood, and coming together? And so, what do you think the problem is, and what are some of the communities you've seen that have lived out, like have done these different identities well? So I don't know who wants to start off. Jonathan, do you want to start? You kind of, when we were our initial phone call, I think you had some good thoughts around that.
Sure, not a problem. Good question. I was kind of writing it down so I could think through it. I think how I would answer that, first of all, is I'm not necessarily sure that I see them as divisions, as much as I see them as responses. And the reason I say that is because at least my understanding of the way the church should exist anywhere, whether we're talking about intentional communities or more traditional church expressions or anything, is that they should be living in response to the needs and experiences and assets and beauty of the community. So the community in and of itself should be guiding us in the ways that we live out our faith. That's why the local church expression is important. No matter how it's lived out, it's important because it's unique to that locality. So I think I've seen quite a few that have done it well, but they've all done it differently because they've listened well to the community, and the community has kind of guided the way that their expression has formed itself. When I think we get it wrong is when we sit down in a boardroom, or we sit down and have a vision, or we have a prayer gathering and we say, Lord, tell us what to do. And then we plop ourselves down into these neighborhoods with these ideas and grandiose ways of being, and then try to graft our neighborhoods into that. Like, hey, this is how we're living. Come see what we do. Come be a part of what we do. Versus organically setting ourselves up there, getting to know the people around us, the community, the assets, the beauty, the brokenness, all the things there, and then allowing that to organically shape the way our faith community actually comes out. And so that would be my number one thing, is if it doesn't begin with listening, then most likely it won't be sustainable. I always say, whoever owns the expression, whoever owns the way this thing is going, is the person who's responsible for sustaining it. So if your personal community, your intentional community, or your church or whatever is the one that's owning everything, we tell what time things happen, where people can go, what to do, then the expectation is that 30 years later, you should still be sustaining it. But if you can express that in a way where it's all of us working together, with our community all working together to see an organic expression of the Lord come up in this community, then our entire community is responsible for sustaining it. And if something was to happen to you or your little community, it doesn't mean that the work that's happened there has to cease. So it's just a different way of entering the space.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, does someone else want to jump in on that?
I can follow, but I gotta say, as a rule, I don't ever usually like to follow Pastor Jay, but I'm gonna try. I've learned the hard way to avoid that whenever possible, but I'll just add to actually what Jay's saying, because what we have seen, at least from the Parish Collective, which for those of you who haven't ever heard of it, is essentially a network of place-based churches, congregations, intentional communities, missional communities, etc. It's kind of a very interesting kind of theological gamut. But there is a primary question that increasingly, I'd say, most people, leaders, groups, congregations are asking, and it goes exactly to what Jay was saying. And that is the primary question, I think, that brings everybody together is first, essentially, in that listening posture, what is God up to in our neighborhood, in our parish? Not, and this is totally normal, not the church question, which is like, how do we grow a church, or how do we sustain a church, or how do we get more people into our church? Fair question. Or in the intentional community perspective, kind of like, how do we be a healthy intentional community? Also, fantastic question. But what we've seen and experienced, a lot of us, is that primary question ends up being a really big deal. So if the first question is, how do we join in what God is doing? That creates actually a different path and journey than how do we be a healthy church? And so it also prompts for a lot of us the question of like, well, it's a big theological question that has global cosmic implications, of course, but we're limited people, we've got bodies and limits. And so that's a big reason why for us, discerning what is a geographic area for which we can be both responsible and is going to have a formative effect on us is big. So not just what might be the hopes and dreams and activity of God in our city or across the country, but right here where we reside in this place that we call home, what might God be up to? And then how do we orient our collective and communal life around that question? You kind of get a 2-for-1. You're both asking what is God up to, and the invitation is right here. And so that's for us why the idea of parish or place, but really like a geographic area that's large enough to live a lot of your life, kind of live, work, play, but small enough to be known and responsive, which I think pretty much all of us understand that it's complex, it's difficult. It's not just like Jay was saying, we prayed, we have a vision, and now our task is to implement it. No, we have ideas, and then we're in this dance with our neighbors and our neighborhood and the systems that govern it, and its history and its stories of injustice. And it's a lot more complex. It's also a lot more beautiful. And so those first questions, I think, that we begin to ask and keep asking are a big deal for a lot of the congregations and churches and intentional communities that we've been able to learn alongside.
Thank you. So Debbie, as you hear that in your context, what comes to mind? If you could describe a little bit of Chapuza for folks as well.
Yeah, so I'm at Jesus People in Chicago, and we're in the Uptown neighborhood, and we share our house. There's about 150 of us, and we share our house with about 90 low-income seniors, and they largely come from Chicago, and some from our neighborhood. And for me, I think that's a place where I feel I get a lot of life just interacting with these, they're not that much older than me anymore, but the folks that share our home and our subsequently our neighborhood, and just helping them to get connected to services. And our neighborhood is like really changing, has been the whole time the 30 years that I've been in Uptown. There's just been a lot of change. I guess you could call it gentrification, and which is such a loaded word, but just how to keep listening to all of our neighbors' needs is really tricky when there's a lot of opposing voices. So I find, like, even in this election cycle, just like being able to stay connected and try to hear what would be best for our neighborhood. Who's going to be leading these next 4 years is a big question, and I'm excited to see what God has in that direction, and how we can kind of support whoever's going to be in office. Yeah, there's just been a lot of really fun ways to be connected, like through community gardening and other like Uptown events. Yeah, I think too, at we have a coffee shop called Everybody's Coffee, where we do art shows and try to have local artists. My friend Carl is really intentional about getting a lot of local artists involved with that space. So when I'm hearing, especially from Pastor Jay, just this like organic listening and trying to really kind of form things from the ground up, it's a shift I'd like to make, but it's hard because we've been an established community for 50 years. So I would love some ideas on how to make that shift into listening. That really sparked my interest.
And Josh, if you can kind of describe some of your work and then just thoughts that come to mind. I think you're at an interesting place of, seeing these different accents in the church.
First of all, just kind of start by saying Englewood Christian Church is not an intentional Christian community proper, as maybe you all would kind of define it, but we are a church that wants to be a healthy church community in a very specific place. But I think the question that I think there you go. I think the question that was being asked is really a question about economics. The church and church communities have been performing a certain kind of economics for a long time now, and a lot of that economics is kind of a mirror for the way the society is functioning through consumption, production, and those sorts of ways that we think about economics. And it's tied to scarcity. I mean, if you look at an economics textbook, it's a science of scarcity, and that's just not what theologically we're trying to embody and proclaim through the way of Jesus or the kingdom of God. So shifting to answer Debbie's question, I think is, yes, listening is a part of it, but listening is a way of opening yourself up to a wider economy that God has inaugurated, which is larger than simply the collection of people that you might name and define as part of your little intentional community or church. It necessitates that you move from a place of openness and abundance and more than and overflowing than protectionism or who's in and who's out and who fits and who doesn't, and which is kind of a fear mentality or a survival mechanism. So I think that's a really key. And then our economy is kind of I think the more healthier expressions of church-based kind of community-based church and communities move from kind of an economics model to almost an ecological model, where then you're participating and growing in a network of folks who are mutually feeding one another and inspiring one another. So I think Englewood is an expression of that. But yeah, I don't know, Dave has been here way longer than I have and has participated in way more neighborhood and community development work than I have, but I'll see if he's got anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understood the question that was being asked, but how the interaction of community and church and maybe some of the development work. And that's something, again, we're kind of at a crossroads ourselves, like understanding who we are. I think the biggest thing that I think that we're probably struggling with when it comes to that is the value of your common life over your common work. And so like, the common work is of little value if you lose that common life. So we're a church and church community in transition as well. I mean, like, it's, as the neighborhood changes, we change a little bit as well. And so like it constantly, we constantly need to be looking at ourselves and finding where we need to, how we can engage with one another better, and also how we can engage with our changing community better as well.
It sounds like kind of a common something that's foundational to this conversation is just the response. Like, I think that's kind of what Jonathan started off with, is like this, responding to your context and the needs of the context, and then who is in the decision-making role. Is it the people with, this specific agenda, or is it coming out of the neighborhood and context?
And Elizabeth, I'd like to just add real quick. Like, I know that sometimes the idea of only being responsive doesn't feel very like practical. Like, we always say, let's be proactive. Let's, but I think there is a proactive responsivity that I'm talking about. It's actually planning to listen, right? Like, it's not just like sitting back and we'll see what happens. No, it's literally this common life that Dave was talking about becomes the conduit in which we're saying this is going to form us together. So that's the difference, right? Like, this formation is not about how we get formed in isolation, but how we get formed in community. And when you look at Jesus's way of formation in scripture, it's never like let me go have an independent Bible study with these 12, right? Like every time he's teaching them in the context of a lived situation in the city. They're walking around. He's telling them these random parables. He's like pointing out stuff and saying, oh, I look like this, you're like this, you know? So I think we've gotten away from that in the church where we try to isolate ourselves for discipleship and then go out for like anything else that we want to do. And I think that all of the life of the way of Jesus is lived in community. And that's how formation actually happens. So I would just say, like, Debbie, it's really just like little small incremental changes of like, how do we think about things communally versus like us planning something and then inviting the community to it? How do we start saying, we won't do this unless the community is involved with it? You know what I mean? So that's not just participating in it, but involved in its creation and sustainability. So.
Other thoughts? Feel free to jump in.
I would offer this maybe as we'll see if this is resonant with y'all, but jumping off from what Jay was just saying, that's so deeply resonant. And a question that it brings up within me that's maybe kind of practical, but I don't think we have time to get into it. Also painful for a kind of a scenario that our family has been in our neighborhood for a while. And that is when starting out or when trying to make maybe significant changes, how do you, and this is actually a question that I'm asking, even though I get the joy of seeing lots of incredible churches all over the country, that like kind of usually small team, if you're starting out, or it might be the elder team of the established congregation, whatever, who are already embedded in the community. They're already asking questions of what God's up to, and they're like responsive, and they see it, a true, not just verbal, interdependent nature with the neighborhood. What are the best ways of creating a sense of strength and momentum within that? There's different names for it. Maybe it is the intentional community. Maybe it's a core team. Maybe it's a particular small group within the neighborhood. That's a question that I can say that I'm asking. And the reason I'll just play my cards here is that my wife and I, we're praying hard for that team, trying to recruit in our neighborhood. And we're like not bad recruiters. And we knew that we needed a team, and it was still difficult to find. But yet we were also being very responsive to lots of opportunities in our neighborhoods with small projects and large. And right now we're asking questions about what are some of the best ways to say we need this team together that's relatively strong and public in order to kind of press in versus just say the two of us or the two or three of us. I don't know if that's making sense, but I offer it because one of the greatest gifts, perhaps, you hear the cartoons, is of intentional communities could be that very strong kind of core collective discipleship environment that's incredibly responsive to the neighborhood. I think that's one of the greatest gifts that the intentional Christian community movement could offer. That's my hunch and guess. I'd love to hear from y'all if you feel like I'm off on that, but it feels really, really important that there is like a bit of a team that has commitment to God's work, to the neighborhood, to one another going forward. If that doesn't make sense, Elizabeth, please forgive me and redirect. But that's something I've been thinking about in relationship to this call.
Sorry, Elizabeth. Just as a response to that, Tim, in some of my work locally here in Indianapolis, my day job actually is working with other congregations that are looking to kind of be more interdependent with their neighborhoods, as Tim described it. And we found that it's been really difficult to change that mindset from kind of what Jay would describe almost a fortress mentality or protection mentality of how do we sustain our congregation in the midst of this thing, as opposed to what we've been talking about here. But one posture, and this goes hand in hand with the kind of responsiveness posture, whereas initially we were thinking like, how can our churches facilitate convening and like pulling together various different parts of neighborhood and community work? How can they participate in that, or how can they contribute to that work? Our conversation has kind of shifted to how can churches and communities be supportive? In other words, how can they fill the in-between spaces? How can they be conveners? How can they be connectors? It's a much more humble approach to neighborhood work, because churches are finding, first of all, there's already people who love their community that have been doing good work for a long time, decades. And when it comes to churches getting involved in the communities, they typically lead with their own visions rather than what we've been talking about. So, but in the community development sphere, particularly, oftentimes, because these are human beings and these are nonprofit organizations that are all looking for money, it happens in kind of very siloed sorts of ways. You got multiple kind of stakeholders in the neighborhood. You got businesses who need to do what they need to do. You have neighborhood associations and interested neighbors that have particular agendas. And a lot of this work overlaps, and some of it is obviously people are coming from very different places and all that kind of work. What the church can do, what intentional Christian communities can do, as kind of Tim is describing it, I think, is set the table. It's like almost a form of peacemaking. It's like, how do we, yes, we love our community. Yes, we're of our community. Yes, we want to participate, but we want to participate in a way that is more like hospitality for all the work that's happening in our neighborhood. And we play that in between space to connect dots and bring good work together in a way.
Just to invite you, if you have questions, you can stick them or put them in the chat. So for instance, I'll read this one out. A question: we're involved in a church community that definitely has a strong fortress mentality, yet also has a lot of great people, resources, and opportunities. One issue is that most people commute from outside the neighborhood to the church. We're one of the few neighborhood people who live in the neighborhood. Does anyone have an example for advocating for a change of mentality within the old guard of a parish? Does that question make sense?
100%. So just as a little background as to why I smiled a little bit when I saw this question. Before I came to Lawndale, I was a pastor in Inglewood, and I told you I was born and raised in that neighborhood. But my attitude was not one of, this is a great place to be. This is where I want to be for the rest of my life. I was trying to get out of there with everything in me. And that was the attitude of every person in my congregation as well. And so, especially in African-American context churches, right? Like a lot of our churches are still located in the areas where we were forced to live. Okay. So, you find the largest, most historical African-American churches in Chicago neighborhoods like Bronzeville, Austin, places like that, where you saw people come up from the South in the Great Migration. And that was the only place they could make home. And thus these huge swaths of churches with thousands and thousands of people in them grow up in these little small geographic areas. But then as people begin to move out and upper mobility happens and all that, people still drive into these churches because this is like historically connected to them, but they no longer live in the neighborhoods that surround those churches, right? So Canaan was no different. It was one of those type of churches. It was Canaan Missionary Baptist Church when I took over in 2006. And all I can say, when I left in 2021, we were Canaan Community Church with about 65 to 70% of the congregation living within walking distance of the church, and then another 25 that were in short driving distance. And then with a strong parish mentality of like, our church only exists because this neighborhood exists. If this neighborhood was to change, so would this church need to change, right? That was a journey that I think began with a small remnant of people who got it. I never believed that the way that congregational change shift happens is through like this big revelatory moment and then like 50 families all say, we need to do this together. That happens rarely, right? If ever. What tends to happen is you get a few, maybe even one. For me, it was one. It was me and my family. Luckily, I was the pastor of the church, so it had a little more impact than maybe if I was just not the pastor. But my congregation thought I was nuts. I mean, I had gotten married, I had moved away, I was in the neighborhood, and I was moving back in. And so not only was I moving back in as like a resident, but then as the pastor of this church, and I was teaching public school as a bivocational pastor, and my school was in the neighborhood. So I was working, playing, living, worshiping, everything in this neighborhood that everybody was saying you're supposed to escape from. And what it began to do was shake the world of my congregation. It began to make them ask serious questions. Why are you doing this? This is not safe. This is not smart, blah, 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 blah. To which I could keep giving my reasonings of what I felt like following the Jesus way was. So I always say it begins first off with somebody living in a way that's countercultural, and people keep wondering why. And you make a big deal out of it, not bragging, but like always, every time I came in, I told them about the community meeting I went to, or this new neighbor I met, how wonderful they were, and how my views of the neighborhood were being challenged by living in it now as an adult. And I was falling in love with it when I thought that it was a place to escape. Like they heard it all the time, to the point to where I'm sure some people were like, okay, enough, but I didn't care. It wasn't enough. And so then as certain people, as individuals began to ask questions and catch vision, I began to challenge. I just began to ask, what would keep you from doing this? Like, what are your reasons? And as people came up with reasons, or as I call them, excuses, I would challenge them. You know, is that based in faith, or is it based in fear? Is that based in scarcity, or is it based in abundance? Is that a kingdom value, or are you thinking like the world when you're saying that, right? And it just began to challenge people to the point to where if you're really following the way of Jesus and trying to trust the Spirit and all those, eventually you start saying, God, this is me. This is not God saying I shouldn't be doing this. And just slowly over a 20-year period, we began to see a shift. Not just people who were there, but some people left. Were like, if that's the way we're going, I don't know if that's God's call in my life, but guess what happened as they left community? People from the neighborhood began to become part of the community because they finally found a place that seemed to care about where they were living and what they were enduring and dealing with every day. So what was this? Some people exited, some people came in, but it began with a lived experience. Like, it didn't begin with theological premises. It didn't begin with great sermons from the pulpit. It didn't begin with me arguing points. Like, it began with, this dude is crazy. Why is he doing this? And so I just think that's always been my way. I think that when I look at the way of Jesus, that the world changes. You know, that's what happens in Acts. Is people are doing crazy stuff. And people are like, what the heck is going on? And because of all this crazy stuff that the Spirit is kind of like guiding people into in the book of Acts, you begin to see all types of shift and change, not only in the church, but in the places in which around them and the people around them. So that's my first, little nugget. I'm sure other people have maybe some more practical things, but it begins with you doing what you do, becoming contagious, as I said, and then challenging people when they try to refute it, to make them see where those refutations are really coming from. Are they really honest, or might they just be making excuses?
We'd like to say that it's caught, not taught.
He said all that I said in one sentence. That was great.
Yep. I couldn't agree with that more. Have you all ever heard that definition of culture change? I think it was David Brooks or something like that said, basically, people find a better way to live. It's usually on the edge of a system or society, and then other people start to copy it. That's how cultures change. So it's true for us in the church too. There has to be a small team of people that can find a better way to live, and then invite people into that, and that takes time. But I love Jay's story, both because it's so hopeful and possible, and also, took 20 years. It was hard as hell.
To the original question, I think it was what do you do in a church that's kind of stuck in an old, and so one thing we did at Inglewood, we actually gathered folks together to talk about what we saw God doing, and not necessarily being a slave to the structures that were already in place. So it was, I mean, it wasn't easy, but I mean, sometimes having conversations outside of the power structures of church is a necessity to move forward.
Thank you for those thoughts.
I would add one other thing to that. Sometimes people don't get a chance to move geographically, but you do have to move them in their passion and care for the community. So even if you can't change your zip code, your affections and cares about the people and place in which your congregation is located has to shift. There were lots of people at my church who never moved their home, but they were at every community meeting. Literally, when you became a member of Canaan Community Church, you became a member of the Resident Association of Greater Englewood. Like that was something you had to do. So your cares for, now I told them, you're concerned with two places now. That's what I would tell them, where you live and where your church is located.
Hmm. So kind of a follow-up question. Oh, just a clarifying question. Can you say more about having conversations outside of power structures of church?
So we're in the independent Christian church tradition, and when I first got here in the early 90s, there was a group that got together, and we literally called it and talked about the group being subversive. We weren't about doing anything, but the eldership of our church was mostly just interested in the status quo, being an urban church that was steadily declining over the years, and it was in a survival mentality. And so good guys, but not the folks weren't able to get out of just trying to keep the ship from sinking. So like we intentionally got together once every week or so, and I mean, we just had conversations about what is the church, and what is the nature of church, and what is the nature of community, and going through Ephesians and Acts, and just sort of reading through Jesus and community, and just doing a lot of imagining for what the church could be outside of what we were kind of trapped in, of just maintaining an existing parish that was trying to be relevant, but wasn't sure exactly how to.
And those dialogues happen within the church, but they also happen to cross into other communities. And I think, as Jay was describing, it really does take someone incarnating something, and you get to experience it. And I think part of that stretching of the imagination has to do with engaging with other folks that were similarly asking the same questions outside of us too. But it's a both and. I mean, that's when I was talking about economics earlier. It's like, that's the question we're kind of stuck on. It's like, is it about holding our communities together, or is it about participating in the neighborhood and potentially getting torn apart? Well, it's a both and. That's a different posture altogether. So,
well, if I can follow on to that. So from the Bruderhof, which has been around for over 100 years, and I've lived in an intentional community that's kind of self-contained more than many for all my life, with the exception of various assignments out, like 6 months with Englewood Christian Church in Indy, and a few other, shorter times. It's still a tension. It's always a tension, a creative tension, something we need to wrestle with, get together and talk about, pray about, and share our questions. Nate, in the community, Nate Durgan, who's also on this call, same thing. I mean, you and I have talked many times about what should we be doing? You know, should we be doing more? And members here, both in membership meetings, but also at the coffee break in the workshop, are always talking about, did you hear about this opportunity? Should we be doing that? I think we should. Let's ask. Let's do this. How can we cover the bases of caring for our young people, our children, our older folks at home, maybe do a little extra, swap some, care shifts so that we can get together in a minivan and go and do this in our neighborhood because it needs doing, because we're called to do it. But I will say it's always a tension. I'm most encouraged to share with other folks like you all, including you all. And when I was able to visit Pastor Jay's church in Englewood, Chicago, Canaan Community Church, in what was that, 2018 after CCDA, it was the most inspiring example of real Christian community development in a urban neighborhood that I had ever seen. And I had been hearing John Perkins for 30 years and wrestling with these questions with our folks. And there, what happened in that church, the women who gave their testimonies and shared about the transformation was one of the most inspiring things I've seen in this whole context. Challenging, very inspiring. It helps us to imagine what can be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, I just want to open it up. The panelists, we'd love to continue to hear, but if other participants want to join in the conversation, you're welcome.
If I may, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe a question about kind of for Pastor Jay and others with that process of like what you talked about, getting involved in your community and everything. Obviously, living in that space sounds like a really important part of that, but just knowing like the limits of one's time and kind of where to focus one's energy. There's always so much going on in a concrete local community. There's maybe other church communities, there's neighborhood organizations, there's maybe different families and stuff that are doing great things. Given obviously like all those are good things, but are there any things that you would say are good starting points because you can only do so much at any one time? And that's to any panelists as well. I mean, if they have similar answers to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that. I think I always tell people the greatest starting point is like the neighbor next door, right? Like it's not this, I think it was David who talked about common work versus common life, right? I think what started for me in Englewood was like playing cards on people's porches and going to barbecues and reframing my thoughts because I had a perceived narrative. And this is what I think we got to all be honest about. This is really the underlying question we're asking ourselves. What do we really think of the place where we are? That's the real question, because that will help us to answer the question of where do I start? Because if I believe that this place is beautifully created, God is here doing great things, then all I got to do is cross the street and I'm going to meet another person who's going to reflect the image of God in a way I've never seen before. And I want to lean into that relationship. I want to meet Miss Montgomery, who lives down the block, who's been living on this block for 50 years, because I'm going to be a better person after meeting her, right? And from there, conversations happen. I meet somebody else new. I meet people come and go, and maybe like work begins, but I don't even have a thought about work when I enter. It's not about work. It's about life. It's about shared life together. How do I just get to know the amazing people that God has put in my life? And what I've learned is, to me, this is what leads you towards what you do. It's who you meet. because for some people, they don't grow into community development entities because that's not what's needed around them. They end up just becoming places to live. Like, we just live together. We just continue to have block parties and birthday parties and go to people's prom send-offs and whatever, right? Like, we're just living life. And then in other spaces, we get together and we see, because of injustice and things that have happened around us, that our neighbors start saying, hey, can we work together on some things that will help our community be what God desires it to be? So I believe it begins with just seeking out relationships, seeking out people first and foremost. As those grow, they'll lead you towards what the actions should be. So I went to places where there were more people. That's how I became a part of the resident association. And those are the young ladies that Toby met, right? I became a part of the resident association because I felt like there would be more residents there. And I wanted to meet more people and see where they lived and what they were doing and, you know, all that good stuff. And it grew into other work. So seek the people first. Don't let it be about work. Find places, go to coffee shops, go to, you know, libraries, go to, like, that's what I mean. Go to schools, right? And just offer your time in the school. What can I do here? Because there are people there, parents, students, teachers. So that's what I would say. Sorry.
Just want to say amen to that. And it connects deeply with what Josh was saying before. If our, and I'm saying this to myself as well, if our posture with how we begin to engage with our neighbors and neighborhoods is not abundant, if it's scarce and fearful, we're kind of stuck from the beginning, honestly. But if it's, oh my goodness, like what Jay is saying, like, I get to engage with this person made in the image of God, who's got all kinds of stories and ideas and assets and gifts and their own dreams. Like, that's an adventure worth taking. Like, let's start there. And those are the best stories. So the most creative, random neighborhood parties and projects, they always start there. They always start with a posture of appreciation and affection. It's a great essay. Some of y'all probably love the writer Wendell Berry. He wrote an essay called "It All Turns on Affection," and I think that's true for us as well.
I think one of the challenges we often face in our neighborhoods is that they're not monolithic. They're not monolithic in terms of culture, in terms of financial stability, and so forth. And it seems like increasingly there's sort of a polarization as renters struggle more and more. So often neighborhoods, the sort of political power rests with the property owners, you know, and then we've also got the issue now of immigration that has become so challenging. So I think one issue for us as communities is, how do we navigate? How do we help? How do we help? You know, how do we not only listen, but help other people listen and appreciate? I don't know if any of you panelists have thoughts about that. I mean, let me just say, so often those that are more disenfranchised in terms of what's going on locally are also more transient. You know, they're renters. They may be there for only a year or 2 years or 3 years. So I don't know, stories about that I think are helpful. I think, you know, that's an issue it seems like we face as communities. What's our posture in all this?
I'll jump in if nobody has something right away. I'll just say this. I think our posture is that this is why it's so important that even if our congregants or our intentional community members don't necessarily get this vision yet, that we push them towards being more invested in the neighborhood, is so that when we get people who are more transient and all that, they have something they're moving into. This is what we learned in Inglewood, in Chicago, is that we learned that we are responsible for creating a culture of our own in which people move in and out of. We don't allow people to move in and out of that and create the culture in and of themselves. So although they're monolithic, they're not monoeconomic, they're not any of those things, we create the narrative and culture of the place. This is a great place. When you move here, you're going to hear, you know, all of the amazing things and stuff and people and all that. And whether you're here for a year or whether you want to buy a home and stay here forever, this is what you're entering into. And there are certain expectations of it as you come in, whether you're immigrating in, whether anything, you will find out. And we want to give you the opportunity, if you want to travel the journey with us, to make this your home. It's got to be invitational to people. No community should be a place where people only go there because they have nowhere else to go. Like, no community should be looked at in that way. So those of us who have built it as a home, even if it's a small remnant of us, we have to create the narrative that this is a place to land, a place to invest, not a place to like flee or pass through, no matter what people think of it or how they got there. So that's the reason why I think that churches have a long-term responsibility, and intentional communities. We have a responsibility to build that space for people so that no matter how they get there, how long they can stay there, if they move on to somewhere else, when they move to the other place, they're going to say, man, let me tell you about this place I used to live. Oh my God, those people love that place. It is incredible, you know, and that's the work I'm doing. That's why, you know, Toby saw our conversation about our Inglewood Rising campaign that the young ladies were talking about. They put up billboards in the neighborhood with pictures of people from the community going to prom, picking flowers, doing things like that, right? So that the people in our community have a different framework about the space. So it doesn't really matter what people on the outside think. It doesn't matter what politicians try to create. We, as the residents of that space, have the most power. I just don't believe, I think we give our power away to elected officials. They're literally hired and fired by us. And so I no longer subscribe to that. I have to cower to them or think about, no, we're building power by, even if somebody's going to be here for a year, when they come in, join this resident association, be here for this year, and know that what you do and where your kids are going to school and things that impact you for this year, you're going to be a part of setting the tone for that. So just make it a welcoming, invite people in, no matter how long they're going to be there, no matter what their economic space, no matter what their perceived narrative about the place is. Challenge it when they get there as, you know, a place that teaches them how to live wherever they go, I guess is the best way to say it.
Thank you. It's what I'm hearing consistently is the role of the church or the community as being a place of building this imagination of what is possible, and then also being setting a table, this posture of hospitality, inviting others in. So I'm not trying to close down the conversation. I am going to just remark that it's 9 o'clock. Is when we officially said we would end. So people are welcome to leave at this point. I think we will, we have another 30 minutes at play that we can stay and the conversation can continue, but this is the formal ending of the time. We're so grateful that you all took time to be with us today. So, but feel free to stay if you'd like to continue on the conversation.
I'm going to have to leave in a minute, but just one thing that I was thinking earlier on when someone was asking, like, how do we change? I just remember years ago, I read this. It's a funny, like, whatever adage or whatever that says it takes a mile to turn a tanker. And I found that imagery really helpful, like this big, boat out somewhere trying to change directions. And it also made me think of that, Ever Given boat that kind of jammed up the canal, but just that idea of like change is hard and it's slow, and just the patience of like, just planting a seed, and maybe you're not even alive when the tree is full grown or whatever, right? Like, I love that idea of just doing, the next right thing and just seeing how God uses that obedience and that listening and that goodness. And the only other thing I was thinking is I remember one day I was really, really, really discouraged about something, and I was just had such a scarcity mindset and was just feeling like really maybe just a little burnt out or feeling discouraged. And I was walking around my neighborhood, and there was a mulberry tree, and there was so many berries on this tree that like the sidewalk was stained purple, and the branches were just heavy. And I just felt like God was saying, I have so much. There's abundance everywhere. If you want to look for that, that would be more beneficial. So anyway, those were just my thoughts. I do have to go, but it was great to be with you all this morning.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, as a contrast, I have a mulberry tree that like sits above my camper, my white camper. The roof of my camper is purple, so I have a different lens.
Yikes.
for that. Yeah.
They are delicious.
Thank you, Deb.
See you guys.
I wanted to get back just to the comment of getting to know our neighbors, knocking on neighbors' doors, and just how very countercultural that is, at least here in Portland. How very challenging it has been for our community to become that kind of, even though we are like very like in theory committed to like neighborhood engagement, the practical thing of walking next door and knocking on a door or someone new who's arrived, it's just it surprises people when you knock on their doors, and it's hard for people on both sides. You can see it's countercultural. So I think we've just lost a lot of those really basic skills of just being a neighborhood, and we have to relearn those again. But I think super foundational.
I know that something you all have done at Spring Water is hold block parties, and I mean, I've seen those work really well. Overcomes a little bit of the discomfort of knocking on someone's door, and then especially when you serve food, I mean, that really gets people out and relating to each other. So start up the grill and grill some hot dogs or whatever.
I think we found though that the people who will come to those block parties are ones where you have knocked on their door or had some sort of connection. At least here, people don't easily just show up to an event, and it may be unique to Portland in part. And over time, as it's become a little more, you know, like this is something we do. The chili cook-off is something we do every year that's taken off in that way. But yeah, I mean, also resonates like this isn't something that's going to change overnight. And, you know, you just keep trying to sniff out where are the openings where you can connect people to each other. But yeah, just it's profoundly countercultural. And it just makes me realize how far we've come from a communal, you know, culture to very individualistic. And there's just a lot of skills that we have lost along the way.
I would definitely agree with that, and it's great to see you. Must be Mary Lou. Seattle's kind of like Portland in that way. The joke about an extroverted Seattleite is that they're staring at your shoes, not their own. But given the food thing too, and this might just be unique to us, but so many of the most beautiful things that came about in our neighborhood in South Park that we've been able to be a part of started because we hosted a soup night at our house, and it was pretty consistent. You know, rainy winters were pretty important to just people. Over time, neighbors just knew Wednesday nights there's soup at the Sorens, and we began to have like very normal neighborhood rules, like we're gonna make the soup. You got to bring a bowl. You got to bring a spoon. We're not doing your dishes. And it, you know, turned into more of kind of a potluck, and all the most beautiful things, including the coffee shop and things like that, we helped started. It all started there. And then kind of evolved to kind of happy hours with parents with young kids and stuff like that. But sometimes the consistency, even for a season, can be a step forward. Like, we're just going to do this because we want to, not like there's no agenda. It's like we want to meet people and we eat, you know.
Yeah, Tim, I think another way of saying that it all turns on affection is that it all turns on desire too. And
100%.
Power is what people do what they want to do, and and most of the times people do the things that they want to do thinking that they actually want to do something else. but here we are, you know, and when people really are convinced of something and they see beauty in something or are drawn to it, it's almost like we talk about agape love a lot, where, you know, the nature of Christian love ought to be like self-sacrifice and whatnot, but eros of drawing people in to something beautiful, the fragrance of it is so powerful. I mean, and our culture figured that out. You know, our culture are engineers of desire, and that's how they've become so successful. And so we have to be embodying something totally different that we believe in and that we love. And that's the thing that really will draw people in. And then when people want to be there because they're drawn to it, there's nothing that can stand in the way. People will do what they want to do.
Thank you for those thoughts. I have a question, not as a facilitator, but as a participant. So something we talk a lot about in our household is the tension of we're people with limited time. And so, like, how do we love our neighbors? But also there's this call of Jesus to the marginalized. And what if our neighbors are middle class, up and coming, you know, people with lots of resources? So there's like a tension there. And how do we use our time? Because we could get to know our neighbors, but if they're all, like, most of our neighbors actually aren't all upper middle class folks, but like, how do you, it's like the call to the marginalized, but then there's also the call in the neighborhood, and especially in gentrifying neighborhoods. How do you reconcile those two calls? And I don't know, it's a tension. We in our household, we're always talking about it. You know, what do we do with our one limited life?
I'm going to lean on something that I heard Jay say one time, Pastor Jay. I don't even know if he remembers, but or maybe he didn't even say it, but that's what I got from what he was saying. In any space, there's somebody that's marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the human nature. That's, you know, part of human nature. And so I think what we call the call to the marginalized or otherwise is a kind of a veiled way of saying, like, do we want to be, you know, saviors or helpers or not? So if we really do see people as persons made in the image of God, there's brokenness everywhere. I mean, they could be the most affluent person in the city, but there is probably profound hardship and or trauma or something in there that needs the connection of a friend, of a neighbor, you know, that loves them. So I don't know. I think the idea of kind of categorizing people as like marginalized or you know, is it this kind of neighborhood or that kind of neighborhood? Am I called to this or that? Is probably not the best starting point. I think the best starting point is, who is my neighbor next door, you know, and starting there.
Thank you.
Yeah, Josh, you were listening well. That's what I say. And just to add just a little, I always say, like, you know, I have a book that I wrote and Church Forsaken. And in the book, I end with this kind of thought of seeing the world the way God does, Church Forsaken perspective, right? Like not seeing it the way we do, but the way that God actually sees it. And if I was to rewrite my book, I would make that first, right? Like, I think that's actually the groundwork of us actually being good neighbors, is to actually be able to see the actual world the way God does it. There's no one God looks at and goes, now they got it together, you don't need to worry about them. move on to these people over here who really need your help, right? Or, if you're in a relationship with that person, there's nothing you can learn from them. There's no mutual transformation that'll happen there. So if you're looking for mutual transformation, you need to choose somebody different, right? No, God doesn't see any person or any place in that way. There's full beauty, full brokenness. We all reflect the glory of God and the brokenness of humanity in every way. And so I think, and this is where I get in trouble with this statement, but I say it where I go anyway, is that I think when people are looked at as like affluent or doing well, that your responsibility as their friend or as a neighbor is actually to pull out the brokenness in their life. Like, it's to help them to realize they don't have to hide the broken things going on behind money, big cars, valences, middle class living. No, you can actually be honest. Because in neighborhoods like mine, we don't even have a choice of whether our brokenness is going to be exposed. It makes the evening news, whether we want it to or not. And so I have to spend time exposing the beauty in our community, help people see, no, this is a great place, or you're a great person. But I think it's the opposite for folks who hold a narrative of, why would anybody think I need help? It's like, or why would I need new relationships? Like, oh, yeah. So I think there's always work to do. You don't have to travel anywhere ever to be a good neighbor, right? Like, or to live out this idea of moving toward the marginalized. Jesus spent real time with the woman with the issue of blood and real time with the rich young ruler. Mm-hmm. It's just what happened with those relationships were very different questions and statements, right? That's all. We spent genuine time. They were both marginalized in some way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Very good.
I think it's Follow-Up Book. Don't you all think that's Follow-Up Book? Right there. I would just briefly add, because Jay's influenced me on this as well, like so many things. If you even just like Google, and this is like a little bit dire, but like there are dark realities like domestic violence that no zip code, mental health, addiction. Like getting more proximate to the pain, it might look differently, but it's probably there. And we all know that there's a direct correlation from someone who may have a lot of money, but is profoundly isolated, living their lives according to a narrative that doesn't cultivate the beloved community in the kingdom of God, and the oppression of neighbors who are also seeking that. I mean, those things are connected. So just to double click on this idea, the path might look different, but people are people.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts?
I have thoughts. It's easy for us, particularly if we're devout believers and we want to be an alternative community and have sacrificed a bit for our neighborhood, to come to a meeting like this thinking, oh, I want to find the right way of doing it. And so we're eager to find, from panelists the answer the right way. And it's kind of fun to see the variety of expressions. And historical perspective, and I always take this kind of historical perspective, is to see the beauty of the diversity. If you think of like the returners, the relocators, the remainers, these kinds of things, it's kind of interesting to see that the Franciscans were relocators. They intentionally moved and became part of tried to join in with the Beguines, this group of women in the 14th century that lived in cities, and they were remainers. They had kind of no other choice who they were, but tried to form alternative communities within their own space and to live in an interesting kind of way that. Then you'll have someone like the Celtic monastic heritage, where you've got people who really, really met the Lord in a big way and started their own community. And Pastor Jay, you used this phrase of doing something good and becoming contagious. I mean, that's exactly what the Celtic settlements were. People became heroes and settlements grew around them. And they became just really attractive. And it's sort of I don't know, a gentrification of a different kind, if you know what I mean. And then you have some, when the neighborhood changes, who say, no, I mean, monasteries throughout history, some of them said, no, we're for the neighborhood. We don't care. You know, it's going to change, but we're here for the neighborhood for the long haul. And these abbeys and whatever have stayed there for centuries. On the other hand, you have Dominicans and other people who say, no, we're not here following the neighborhood. We're here following the people. And so they will move to follow the people, whether it's a language group or a culture or these sorts of things. And to me, the excitement is to hear all your stories and see it's just following the same thing. There is no single right way, but through discernment, we're able to hear God's voice for us as a community and follow as best we can in the middle of it.
I love that, Evan. Hey, y'all, I was just reminded that I got to take off. What a gift it's been to be with you all. Thanks, Elizabeth, for your facilitation. Such a gift to meet you all. Stay in touch.
God bless. Yeah, I got to jump off to everybody. God bless you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I'm an open book. I'm going to drop my email in here before I leave. Anybody want to holler at me? No hesitation. All right. God bless you guys.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, everyone. This is great.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's probably a good time to close, I imagine. This has been a really rich conversation. If you want to, I would just love to hear everyone go out with what impacted them. You have some time just to stay on. Something they learned.
Let me just say one announcement, Elizabeth, if I could. We have one other call scheduled this spring, which is April 15th. And Nathan and Roberto and others from Saltillo are going to share some about some of the transitions their congregation, I think, has been making, partly through their relationship, coming about through their relationship with Inglewood in Indianapolis. So I think it'll be a bilingual call, should be fun. So we'll be announcing more about that as we get closer.
Thank you.
I want to say I think it's all been very rich. I really appreciate your last comment, Evan. I so much believe that there is a diversity that we find, and listening to God and the discernment of where the Spirit is leading us comes up with all these wonderful models that we've got. I always appreciate you bringing in the history of that, so that we realize that there's always people who have been before us, and we can learn from what they've done too. So very good closing comment, I thought.
I like the comment of it just starts next door and it being based on affection. So it's not programmatic. It's really just loving the people around you.
Yeah, and I think what Tim and Josh were both sharing, and others also, about the, people finding a better way to live. Josh, what you were saying, looking for the arrows. I mean, it's got to be modeled. It's got to be something that people want. You can preach sacrifice all day long, but it's going to be, people seeing that way to live and finding a way to wholeness that is going to really attract them and give them inspiration and energy to live the life.
Mm-hmm. Any other closing thoughts from folks? Rusty, Mary Lou, Nathan, Josh.
I guess. Well, I could say that, Pastor Jay is a 10 out of 10 extrovert, and he just loves meeting people, and he just loves finding all the fascinating things about all the different people in the neighborhood. And I'm working with a community that seems to have attracted mostly introverted people who are rather scared of making contact with someone that's a stranger, and also people who are all pretty tied up in their work schedules so that there's not much extra time. And it seems like one mention that I did not hear was the benefit of people having more available time. And so relationships in the neighborhood, they take time. And also, as far as people in a neighborhood who are not that marginalized, I have found that there are people who are doing just fine, who have no relational space for new friendships, and other people who have very few friends, and they will latch on to that opportunity. And in some cases, that is also kind of time consuming because there may be a reason why they actually don't have hardly any friends. And so in the beginning, it becomes a lot of work and in tolerating, and then you grow very fond and affectionate about that person, and you really appreciate them, and you see their gifts, and you cherish that relationship. But it is part of community building in the neighborhood, I think, is being ready for relationships that are not as natural and free
Affection
and easy.
isn't immediate.
So anyway, that's some of my thoughts is how do you help? Something Mary Lou said I always thought bears repeating is that our whole goal is to learn what it means to love your neighbor. And when once asked, well, if Springwater, this experiment, if it works, what will it look like? She said, if it works, I will have become a more loving person. I love the idea that our mission field, the people all around us in this neighborhood, it's about learning, not about changing them, but about learning how to love people and how to become a more loving person. And so that puts the focus on less task-oriented, less goal-oriented, less manipulative, and a little more receptive learning and maybe asking for help instead of offering help, for example.
Thank you. Nathan, do you have any thoughts? You're okay.
Yeah, a couple of obviously everything was just wonderful and a blessing, but a couple of thoughts that really stood out were the initial comments from Pastor Jay in terms of those who own it, sustain it, and how we can celebrate the ownership and the sustainability of what God is doing, and encourage that as communities. And so I'm thinking of, for example, in our context, where there is a property and there's lots of children and they join in our church garden and play. And so their sense of belonging, their sense of owning, their sense of sustaining the church garden, and that this is a safe place, this is a fun place, this is a great place to play together is something that really resonated. And then the second thing that really stood out for me was just the idea of Inglewood Rising from Pastor Jay's book, and the celebration of the beauty within the community and the billboards and things of that nature. And so what kind of woke up in my imagination was one of our neighbors right across the street. Their job is to make photos, like publish and deliver these to people's homes and things of that nature. And so I was just thinking of, what if, we as a congregation intentionally sought out and celebrated this person's job in order to celebrate not only what they do, but also what God is doing with the congregation and others within the relationships that we have. And so I was just thinking of how it would be nice to kind of be intentional and reach out to this neighbor across the street and start purchasing some I forget the word, but it's like it's like whatever the border is that you put on a photo. I forgot the word, but they make those. And so if we purchase those and then started hanging those like in the church garden or in the around the church, it could be another way to practically celebrate not Inglewood Rising, but Salvador Rising, and all the beautiful things that God is doing amongst us. And so those were two thoughts that came to mind among all the other wonderful things that were shared.
Thank you for that.
I think Roberto thinks that's a good idea, Nathan.
Yeah. Dania, my wife, she was telling me the other day, we need some T-shirt that says Puro Salvador. It's like a pride of the neighborhood. Some images that represent something like that. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm probably going to think this is probably a good time, unless someone else has something burning to share. I don't know, David or Roberto.
I have a really quick question.
Yeah.
Really, who in Englewood do I contact to talk about housing?
It depends what kind of housing you're looking for.
How about we? Oh, well, I was gonna say, yeah.
You can send me an email. Go ahead, Evan. Send me an email.
Okay, I'll send you an email.
Okay.
All right. Blessings all. Thank you for your time this
Thank you all.
Saturday.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Go in peace.